ethics, or perhaps more honestly speaking, an introduction to ethics. Here's where we're going to be going in this session. We're going to be talking about what type of an animal ethics is, why do we bother with it, some of the main approaches that we can have to ethics, and of course we also want to ask the question, what would a biblical ethic look like? So this session again is it's more foundational. We're building something that we can then draw on and build further on in subsequent parts of the JBC course, and actually for the rest of our lives as well. Now, this is a little bit of a long session. If we were to do this face-to-face, it would certainly be a double session. So fasten your seatbelts, and of course, if it gets a bit long for you, have a 5-minute stretch break and then come back to it as well. I don't know what the word ethics, or perhaps also the word morality, does in your mind. Now, to some people, the words ethics and morality have a little bit of a negative ring to them. For example, ethics as somebody being clever to try and work out what kind of behavior they can get away with, or morality, perhaps you're picturing that person wagging their finger at you and telling you what you are and especially aren't allowed to do. Now, I don't mean those words in that way, certainly not for this session. So I mean ethics and morality in their most positive sense, I think. So let's explore that a little bit. I hope you have your handout in front of you as well, which has the definitions. So one could define ethics, in some circles it's defined quite narrowly as ethics being about identifying what is right and wrong. But I would like to suggest a much wider definition. So it includes identifying what's right and wrong, but it's so it is the study of what is right and what is good. It's about that, but it's also, it doesn't just stay in the head. It goes much further. Ethics is also about the decisions that we make and whether we're making good decisions. It's about performing right actions. It's about becoming good people or becoming good communities. So the way I would like us to define ethics and to be able to see ethics is much wider, that it involves the dimensions of thinking and reflecting, yes, but also about it involves being and becoming and choosing and doing and loving and relating. So there's both a theoretical and a practical dimension to ethics, and both an individual and a group dimension. Ethics involves knowledge and will and character and conscience, community, relationships, actions, all those things. So sometimes, depending on where you go, and perhaps if you have some course on ethics elsewhere, sometimes ethics and morality are seem to be different things. Ethics is more used for the theory and then morality for the practice. But I think for the purposes of our course, I'm just going to use these words interchangeably. So ethics and morality both mean everything, the theory, the practice, etc. Now, let's start just by asking, why would we bother with ethics? Why would we bother with thinking about what's right and what's good, with good decisions, with right actions, with becoming good people? Why would we bother with it? I'm hoping it's not too difficult to answer that one, but here's an attempt to answer it. One way we can answer it is that we're facing it everywhere and it's needed everywhere. Let me give you some examples. So think of anything to do with medicine, with healthcare. There are huge ethical and very complex ethical issues that we need to think through in that domain. So specifically, I think around beginning of life issues, end of life issues, all sorts of things to think about there. And also how we treat human life, how we treat genetics. Okay? Increasingly, we have the technology to actually edit our genes. There are all sorts of, again, issues around that. So that's one of the reasons we would need ethics. Anything around HIV and AIDS, how we treat it, we approach it, how we treat someone who is infected, all sorts of ethical issues around that. Our current lockdown, I think, raises some ethical issues. I think it's almost like a little bit too new a situation for us to be quite alert in thinking some of those things through. But yeah, some of the ethics of weighing up the damage of the disease versus the damage of the cure, or of the way we're trying to tackle the disease, right? How this thing plays into how we use power, whether it increases or decreases inequality, what it does to some of the rights and freedoms that we have. So there's quite a lot of thinking I think we could do about that. Anything around capitalism or any of its alternatives for that matter. Okay, so how do we do economics? And questions around how resources are owned, distributed, accessed, questions around how risk and reward is distributed, questions around how whether people are able to participate in the economy or whether they are marginalized. So, huge questions of right and wrong when we get to our economics. This one, unfortunately, happens in our country. So the ethics around bribery, corruption, we know is a huge issue, not just in our country but all around the world. The ethics around how we handle our natural resources and how we manage not only parastatals, but I suppose any organization or institution, right? Questions around leadership. What is good leadership? What is bad leadership? Anything around the justice system is around good and bad, right? It's around figuring out what is good and what is bad, and how to deal with things that aren't so good and how to pursue goodness. Questions of inequality. As you know, I think South Africa is, I suppose, almost like trying hard to be the most unequal country in the world. How do we deal with that morally? How do we deal with that ethically? The media, what are they reporting? How are they reporting it? How are they describing it? Are they being fair? Are they being unbiased? Lots of questions around that. Land, okay, big issue again in our country, right? Who owns it? Who should own it? How do we handle the land issue? How do we solve the land issue? Education, right? Who has access? Are there huge disparities in the access? And what are we educating people for? What values are we instilling, etc., etc.? Then the way we're handling our planet, our environment. How are we, our consumerism and its effects on the side. Huge ethical issues just around ecology and how we're handling our planet. Then anything to do with gender relations as well as with gender identity, two huge topics that are complex, right? But where we need to really think through what it is that is happening and again, what goodness might look like. Racism, how we do life together in South Africa, huge issues around that. And how we handle the foreigner, how we handle someone from the outside. Again, lots of things to think through there. How we treat people who do not think like us, who do not believe like us. Okay, so how do we handle, how do we treat the other? That's, again, a great domain of ethics. And then also the whole field of technology, or perhaps more specifically in this diagram, artificial intelligence. Okay, so there too, there'll be huge ethical questions that we need to ask, and we need to ask them now before the technology runs away with us. So what does this technology do for how we treat each other, how we relate with each other. Does it increase or decrease inequality? What does it do for our jobs or for the way we do our jobs? So there's a lot of questions that we mustn't be scared of asking, that we need to address. And then also at a personal level, how do we treat each other just at an interpersonal level, and how do we handle disagreements? How do we handle conflict? How we treat our time? Okay, it's not necessarily morally neutral. So that too might very well be an ethical question. And how we treat our money as well. How do we earn it? How do we spend it or use it? Okay, those are ethical questions. Those are questions of right and wrong. Those are questions of good and evil sometimes. And I might have given this example before. Even the coffee that we're drinking is perhaps not ethically neutral, because the question we do need to ask is whether everybody along the supply chain actually got a fair deal, or whether I'm drinking my coffee at the expense of the coffee picker in Ethiopia who wasn't paid enough to even feed their family properly. So even in things like that, we are so networked relationally. And the moment we are networked relationally, we are networked ethically, because so much of ethics is about how do we treat each other. Now, the question really becomes, how well have we been equipped to think ethically? Have we been given the tools or perhaps the language to think through, especially some of the more complex ethical issues? Some issues are simple, right? It's very clear to see right and wrong, but other issues are rather more complex. How have we been equipped or trained? Just a little bit of I suppose, drawing on personal experience. I don't remember having an ethics subject at school, so we had lots of subjects, but this would have been an important one, right? Figuring out what goodness is and how to bring it about, and how to be good and how to do good. So I'm not sure how well school equipped me on that, or university for that matter. So again, personal experience, I did a 4-year engineering degree in which we had just about nothing on ethics. Now, how did that happen? Okay, I know a lot of disciplines like maybe engineering or accounting like to think of themselves as ethically neutral, but they're not. They totally aren't. So even if you just go back to that example that I mentioned about the technologies that we create and how we use it and whether we are using it so that human beings can flourish, or are we using it in a way that actually degrades and diminishes human beings, that's an ethical issue. Then I'm wondering how well or badly church has equipped you to think through ethical issues. Perhaps your experience, I know this is quite frequent, has been that the church perhaps does tell you on a personal morality level how to behave, what to do and what not to do. But have you been given, again, just some way of being able to think through some of the more complex issues, and whatever the workplace is, any of the ones that I've mentioned, whether you're in healthcare or in advertising or in retail or wherever, have you been equipped to actually handle some of the ethical issues that inevitably arise at the workplace? So again, personal experience, I've spent quite a few years of my life in the corporate world, and there certainly were occasionally some instances in which something was happening that didn't quite sit right with me. But it's almost as if I lacked the tools and lacked the language to be able to express myself and to be able to think this thing through properly. And the workplace also wouldn't have, at least explicitly not, equipped me to deal and think through and talk through some of these issues. So I suppose in some ways, welcome to JBC. If it hasn't happened for you elsewhere, this session and also subsequent sessions are an attempt to help us and to equip us in this area. Now, the importance of ethics for us happens in various domains. Okay, so it's about us as churches. Okay, so not only what do we do within the church, but also what sort of role does the church play, your church, my church, in the context in which we've been placed. Okay? How does it interact with, how does it engage with anything that happens outside of the church walls? Ethics is an important issue for that. Ethics is important for us as individuals. I think that one's clear to see, just personal morality, but also as communities. Whether you're an employer or an employee, ethics is important. Whether you're a leader or a follower, ethics is important for us as voters. Okay, how do we vote, and how do we vote well? Similarly, as consumers, okay, we can make consumer choices. Are we making good consumer choices? What type of companies are we buying for? How are they treating their employees, their environment, etc.? Are they being ethical? We can make those choices, right? We don't have to buy this product. We can buy that. We don't have to go to this company. We can go to that one. Also, the products that we're buying or the services that we're buying, are we doing well with that? Are we doing things that that are good for us and for others? Then, as shareholders, you don't have to necessarily be a direct shareholder in a company. If you have anything by way of a pension fund, then indirectly you are a shareholder in various companies. Do you know which companies those are, and again, how those companies are operating and whether they're doing good or bad? As citizens, just as, I suppose, responsible citizens, and any impact that we have in that, or any other influence that we may have in all of these areas, ethics is important. In all of these areas, we have both the opportunity and the responsibility to be Christian cultural leaders, to link it back to the previous session that we did in this course. We have the opportunity and the responsibility to do good, to be good, to speak good, to act good. Now, here's a question. I haven't yet linked it to the Bible too much, so let's just make that link for us so that you don't think I'm somewhere in a completely different space and very far away from the Bible. So let's try find that link. How would you answer this question? Where in the Bible would you find ethics? So where in the Bible would you find something along the lines of what's good, what's bad, people figuring it out? Where in the Bible would you go for your guidelines on good and bad, on ethics, on morality? Take a moment. Okay, I'm going to go on. If I haven't given you enough of a moment, then press pause and make the moment as long as you need. Here are some possible answers. These are just possible answers that you may have come up with. You may have had others, and those would also, I'm sure, be good answers. I think I would start with the very nature of God and his purposes. Okay, so God is good. So if ethics, remember, is about goodness, then the one we look to for what that might be like and look like is God, his character, his purposes. Then you may have thought of Genesis 3 as the first human moral failure, so to speak. But hopefully you're also able to see that ethics in the Bible goes far, far wider than that. So as we fast forward, and again, I'm just giving examples, you may have much more. The law, one of the things that the law does in the Old Testament is in some ways it describes the good to us. Yeah? So it describes what goodness may look like, what a good society might look like. Some of the Old Testament narratives are about ethics. Often that's not explicit. Okay? So often We're not given an evaluation of, well, this person did this and that was good or that was bad, but we certainly follow the stories of people. We see the choices people make, and in many ways we see the consequences of those choices. So that certainly also guides us in our ethics. Then a lot of times the prophets are speaking truth into particular situations, or to those in power, are calling to account, are reminding people of what goodness is, are reminding people of to leave sin behind and to pursue the positive alternative. Proverbs, a lot of the Proverbs, if you think about them, are about how do we be good, how do we do good. Jesus, his life, his teaching, everything about his life, everything about his teaching is a demonstration, I think, and a role model, and as well, of course, a teaching of what is good and what is right. One of the things Jesus says, amongst many, is love God, love neighbor. Notice there too, that is a description of goodness. That is how to be ethical, right? Is love God, love neighbor. The letters of Paul and others, certainly the second half of a lot of those letters are around how do we behave? Who are we, and what are we doing as people who follow Christ, as communities who follow Jesus? And so it's about being and becoming good people. So I suppose what I'm trying to illustrate with the slide is ethics is everywhere in the Bible. So when we're talking ethics, we're very much talking Bible. We're not talking something that is divorced from or different from the Bible. So much of the Bible is about being good, doing good, is about figuring out what is right and good, making good decisions, performing right actions, becoming good people. So, having said that, how would you respond to these objections? So if somebody were to say to you, or perhaps that's even something that you say, but if somebody says ethics is unimportant and outside of God's concern, our task is to share the gospel, right? So ethics isn't important. God isn't concerned with it. What are you on about this ethics stuff? Surely all we need to do is share the gospel. How would you answer that? Take a moment to think about that. So perhaps, again, a possible answer might be, clearly I think we've seen that ethics is very, very much God's concern, okay? Because ethics is about goodness, and goodness is very much about God's concern. Goodness is who God is in many ways. And so, yes, our task is to share the gospel, never do anything less than that. And the gospel, sharing the gospel itself is a good act, right? You're doing this in order to bless people, in order to connect them to the source of goodness. But it doesn't just stop there, because once somebody's understood the gospel, or once somebody is in a saving relationship with Jesus, then their life doesn't just stop there. There is daily life in which to figure out how to be faithful to God, and how to follow him well, and how to walk with him. And daily life includes a lot of decisions about goodness and what's right and what's wrong. And so it's certainly part of our everyday life. What about this one? Ethics is unspiritual. It makes us rely on our own wisdom and cleverness, not on God. Again, take a moment. How would you respond to that? Okay, so a possible answer that I might give is, it is certainly possible for people to try and do an ethic without God. That's certainly possible. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to get to the wrong answer. They might, by the grace of God, still get to a right answer or a half right answer. But now for us as Christians, now surely there is also an option to do our ethics very much in reliance on God, in dependence on God, and asking Him to fill us with wisdom and seeking His wisdom. So it's certainly possible and desirable to link our ethics to God, or to allow God to shape and inform our ethics. If you remember the One Tuesday session, I also tried to show how everything we do has a spiritual dimension. So we cannot possibly say that ethics is unspiritual. Everything we do has a spiritual dimension. It should be easy to see with regard to something like ethics or morality. It's if it is about what is good, I think we can see the clear link or the clear spiritual dimension of that. Now, what about this one? We don't need to think about ethics. We just need to pray for the Holy Spirit to guide us. Okay, so again, I'd say there's a half-truth in that. We do pray for the Holy Spirit to guide us, but surely the way that the Holy Spirit guides us is He guides us through our faculties, through our ability to think and feel and act and pray and all those things. So I don't think the Holy Spirit wants to almost like autopilot us in this, and we mustn't think about it at all. Surely part of God's mission with us is to grow us in our ability to understand goodness and to make good decisions and to make good actions. So totally we rely on the Holy Spirit, but as part of our reliance, we also think it through, and we make good decisions. We grow in our abilities. So we don't bypass our faculties. God grows our faculties. And then perhaps one more, do not judge and do not offend. Okay, so somebody might say, look, I'm not sure about this ethics thing, because surely I shouldn't be judging people. I shouldn't be offending them. So I shouldn't be, sort of pointing to what's right and wrong, because that would be to judge. That would be to offend. How would you answer that? And again, there's a lot that can be said on that score. Perhaps one thought on that would be, certainly we can affirm we shouldn't be judgmental, and also that we shouldn't be, almost like intentionally offensive. Don't be that guy. But surely it's important that we are discerning. Right? That is an important life skill, whether you're a Christian or not, for that matter, that we're able to discern, okay, what's good for us, what's good for other people. Okay, not all paths are equal, not all decisions are equal, not all behaviors are beneficial. And it is important for ourselves and for others to be able to see that. Now, of course, we always need to take the log of our own eye first, and we need to work on our own lives. But I think there is a place for, especially if we love someone or care about someone, to also point out where we feel that perhaps they're not following the right direction, and to do that gently and to do that with grace, and to, do that relationally. Hoping that makes sense. Let's move on. Again, this is quite probably an incomplete list, but just some thoughts about why we should bother with ethics as Christians. We are commanded to be good. We are commanded to do good, which includes avoiding evil. Okay, we will be judged. It is important what we do. What we do matters. We seek to glorify God in everything. We seek to grow in Christ-likeness. We are God's stewards and ambassadors. We need to grow in and be equipped for righteousness. We increase our ability to engage with people and culture, to be salt and light, if we are going to bother with thinking through ethics, thinking through what's good and what's right. In doing that, I think we're also providing witness to the truth and the goodness and the relevance of the gospel. People can then see the effects of what happens when the gospel's got a hold of someone, right? Because it will propel us in the direction of seeking the good and trying to bring it about. It makes us aware of our sinfulness and our need for salvation. Ethics also helps us to reimagine the good. The world needs godly moral direction. We do seek the good of all people. In ethics, morality, seeking to do and be what is good, it's an expression of our faith and hope. It's, in some ways, it's who we are, or at least who we are aspiring to be. A slide that's not in your notes, but you've seen me do something similar by way of summary. Why bother with ethics as Christians? Well, it's for our own growth and sanctification. It's part of God's journey, God's mission with us, is that He grows us into better, more whole human beings. Our witness, our evangelism, so certainly as we seek to figure out the good and bring it about, that is a way of witnessing. In some ways, it almost like it affirms our what we're trying to say in our evangelism. We're showing what it looks like when one follows Jesus. And then, of course, being salt and light. I think that's the obvious one. Okay, we seek not only good for ourselves, but for all people. We seek to be that salt, to be that light. And all, if you were to give it a single summary sentence, we do it all for the glory of God. Now, you will have seen me give that slide before in terms of why bother with EGW, with engaging with God's world. It's a similar slide, but everything we do in terms of engaging so often has the ethical dimension. So often it's about what is good and what isn't, and making good choices. So next section, I just want to bring us to thinking a little bit deeper about how do we sort of work out this ethics thing. So all this is good and well. Yeah, it's in the Bible. Yeah, it's important. But now let's roll up our sleeves and work out, how do we, by what tools do we think through, especially some of the complex issues? So I presume you understand the idea of an ethical dilemma. An ethical dilemma is where it gets complex. Now, many ethical decisions are actually not complex. So I think a lot of life, it's actually pretty straightforward. So should I steal or not steal is not an ethical dilemma. The answer is clear. Okay, I shouldn't steal. So that's not really a dilemma. An ethical dilemma is where it gets a little bit more messy, and where it sort of almost like seems like whichever way I go, that it's tricky in terms of the ethics of it. Now, let me give you an example. Let me give you a scenario. Now, normally, when you do an ethics course, that's what people do. They give you this scenario that is specifically designed to make you think and struggle through thinking through what to do in a particular situation. So let me try one on you. So here's our scenario. Imagine you're just busy coming home, and you're just opening the gate or the door to your house, and along comes, running down the street, comes a guy, and you can see he's got this fear in his eyes, he's out of breath, and he comes to you and he says, hide me, he's after me, he wants to kill me, please help me, please hide me. And then in that moment you say, yeah, okay, sure, please go in at the kitchen, there's a broom cupboard there, that's big enough, you can hide inside that. And you've hardly done that, and a second man comes running down the street, and shall we give him a knife or a gun? Let's say he's got a gun, and he approaches you and he says, "Where is he? Where is he?" So now, in that situation, how do you answer? Now, different people might handle that situation quite differently. So some people might answer, who? Okay, now, of course, that's just playing for time a little bit. The guy with the gun will say, well, the guy that I saw running into your house, that's who. Okay, so you could potentially answer, well, he went that way, and point down the street. You could potentially say, well, he's in the broom cupboard, help yourself. You might have some other possibilities there. You might be trying to stall for time. You might be trying to, obviously put yourself in the way to shield the other person, but just then realize that that's what you're doing. You are then risking being harmed yourself by that person, which may well be the decision that you would make. But can you see what's happening in that scenario? Basically, what it's trying to do is it's trying to sort of take us to a place where we have this ethical trade-off, where basically what you're doing is you made to trade off the principle of not lying with the outcome of trying to save that person's life who's in the broom cupboard, right? So I think you get that, right? So am I going to lie to save a life? Okay, is that the lesser of the two evils, so to speak? And that's just, I think, one way of illustrating how some things aren't straightforward and are sometimes a little bit difficult. And so one thing just to point out on the side is I've given you more stuff in your handout to think about, some further questions, some further ways to think through where it gets difficult. You can do that in your own time. You can pause if you like. But I really just want to launch us into the three main approaches that people have when it comes to looking at ethics. Okay, so almost like the three main ways in which we make ethical decisions, the three main modes of ethical decision making. Now, you would get those, I suppose, in most courses on ethics. Let me dive into them. The first way is, forgive the big word, okay, teleological ethics. Telos, the idea of the goal, the end. The point there is that this type of way of looking at ethics is about looking at outcomes, at consequences, at results. Okay, so this way of making ethical decisions is to ask, well, which way leads to the best result, to the result that is most good? So if I'm faced with a dilemma, with a difficult decision to make, if I use this method of deciding, what I will do is I will say, okay, well, if I decide this way, it'll lead to this outcome. If I decide that way, it'll lead to that outcome. Which outcome is better? Therefore, which direction should I take? Does that make sense? So it's all about if I'm faced with a decision, which decision gives the best results, the best consequences, the best outcomes. Now, there are two almost like sub-forms of this way of deciding. The first one is what ethicists call ethical egoism. What that means is basically what I'm going to decide is what is best for me. So we've been talking about this ethics being about which is the best outcome. Well, what kind of outcome? Well, if I do ethical egoism, well, the outcome that's best for me. Here is an example. In the days before lockdown, many, many months ago, I was once on my way to Johannesburg Bible College, and I was stuck in this traffic. And so I had the chance to look at some of the advertisements down the middle there. And there was a series of ads that City Power had put on to try and sort of make people pay for their electricity. And one of them said, pay on time, avoid being cut off. Now, can you see how that would be an ethical egoism type of an argument? It's basically saying, look, you need to make a decision on what is best for you. If you pay on time, you avoid being cut off. That is a good outcome for you. That is the outcome that you want. You don't want the electricity to be cut off. Therefore, pay. Okay, it's best for you. So it's an example of ethical egoism. Let me, I suppose, by way of another example, let me give the example of a bribe. All right. So if you're in a situation where you're kind of being invited to pay a bribe. If you think along the ethical egoism route, you might say something like, okay, well, if I pay the bribe, I will get what I want. So therefore, it's the best outcome for me. Therefore, I will pay it. You might also go the other way with that. You might say, well, if I pay the bribe, I might get caught. Getting caught is a bad thing for me. Therefore, I don't pay the bribe. Now, either way, can you see I'm giving you an example of ethical egoism? It's like it's looking at outcomes. What type of outcomes? Well, the outcome that is best for me. Now, I'm going to stir a little bit and just point out that a lot of our evangelism actually does that. Okay, we sort of go, you want to accept Jesus because you want the best results for you, or you want to, I don't know, avoid hell, or you want an abundant life or something like that. So I'm not saying that makes it wrong the way we do it, but just be aware that that is what we frequently do. And perhaps let that not be the only way that we do evangelism. Let that not be the only thing that we do. A lot of business ethics does ethical egoism. Okay, so it's what can I get away with? What's best for our business, for our company? A lot of politics does that, right? It asks the question, what is best for our party? Okay, so now ethical egoism now in the group sense, right? Us, our party, rather than asking what is best for everyone. So ethical egoism is big. A lot of our decisions about good and bad, about which route to follow, about what to do, is actually ethical egoism type based. And so I think on each of these, let's think through briefly, what do you think some of the positives are and some of the pitfalls? Now, I think you can, on this one, see the pitfalls much more easily, but also think of some of the positives. So again, just to give you a moment, some of the positives, some of the pitfalls. As I said, it's probably much easier to see the potential pitfalls of this one, how it promotes conflict as each of us just tries to take care of ourselves. It's very self-centered. It's relationally destructive. In terms of the positives, I think there's probably, I say this carefully, but there's probably such a thing as healthy self-love, okay, where we need to take care of things, including ourselves. So it's good that we don't run into things that are going to be bad for us, that are going to damage us. So it's good to ask the question, is this good for me? It's not a bad question to ask. So I'm hoping that you're also able to see the positives of this way of thinking. Now, another subcategory, we're still looking at results, we're still looking at outcomes, is what has been called utilitarianism. Okay, so utilitarianism basically says, okay, we're looking at outcomes, so we're making ethical decisions based on, well, which road is going to give us the best outcome, but now we measure outcome by what is best for everyone. Okay, so in utilitarianism, we ask, what is the greatest good for the greatest number of people? And not just about me, but what is best for everyone? What is the best outcome for the greatest number of people? So one day when I was driving to JBC and was stuck in this traffic, I saw this sign: illegal connections kill. Now, you can see perhaps this is about illegal connections kill you, in which case it would be another example of them appealing to your ethical egoism. But what they probably mean here is, well, just remember that if you put an illegal connection, you might kill other people. Okay, a child might be playing where you've just connected in, and they might just get electrocuted and die. And do you want to do that? Surely that's not good. Okay, so surely your illegal connection is not producing positive results for other people. Can you follow that to some extent? So in some ways, this is a utilitarian argument. What is the greatest good for the greatest number of people? Let me also go back to my bribe example. So if you were to look at it in terms of utilitarianism type of thinking, and you are faced with the situation of the bribe, you might think something like, okay, well, if I pay that bribe, then I am able to get those life-saving medications through customs, and it can get to the people that it needs to, and it can save lives, and therefore I will pay the bribe. Can you see? It's about what is the best outcome? Surely that's the best outcome, so therefore I will do what it takes to produce that outcome. You might also say, also a utilitarian argument, okay, if I pay that bribe, what am I doing in terms of the type of culture that I'm creating? I'm helping to create a corrupt culture. I'm helping to create a society in which we can no longer trust each other. And that's a bad outcome, and I don't want to do that, and therefore I won't pay the bribe. So again, can you see, even though now I'm almost like taking it the other way, it's still a utilitarian argument. I'm still looking at what is the greatest good for the greatest number of people. On this one too, take a moment to think about what some of the positives are and what some of the potential pitfalls of this way of making ethical decisions would be. Do you like it? Do you not like it? Why do you like it? Why do you not like it? I think on the positives, ethics ought to make a difference in outcomes. All right, so outcomes do matter. So it's good and it's important that we ask about outcomes. Positive about this would be that there's a goal orientation to it. There's purpose. There's intentionality. There's future directedness. So I think this approach in some ways encourages a vision for the good and its realization. It's a good thing. But of course, there are also many pitfalls. I think one of the biggest potential pitfalls of utilitarianism is that just it assumes that you know so much more than you do, and that you can look into the future, and that you can work out almost like the consequences of this road versus the consequences of that road. But often things are so much more complex, right? There are all sorts of factors that perhaps you don't see or don't consider, all sorts of unknowns. So how can you be sure that if you follow that road, that what you hope the outcome will actually be the outcome? Perhaps there's some unintended consequences that you didn't see. Another huge potential pitfall of utilitarianism is almost like the temptation to reduce ethics to mathematics. So if you think of, for example, stem cell research, and in some ways, the argument behind using embryonic stem cells is, well, if I sacrifice X% of embryos, then I have a Y% chance of helping Z% of people. But now, what are the values for X, Y, and Z, right? And can I actually think about it in that way? It doesn't make sense to reduce ethics to mathematics. Other potential pitfalls is sometimes the goals that you're trying to pursue are quite distant. Sometimes the controls in order to achieve them are quite inadequate. Sometimes also there is leaning towards disproportionate punishment in that. Okay, so the greatest good for the greatest number of people, and you better conform to my idea of the greatest good for the greatest number. And if you don't conform, well, then we will deal with you. And so you will have heard the saying, the end justifies the means. Now, that is a utilitarian saying in some ways. And some of the greatest atrocities in the history of humankind have been committed by saying the end justifies the means. So those are some of the potential pitfalls of utilitarianism. Right, good. Are you still with me? That was the first of three main modes of how to make ethical decisions, is around consequences, results, outcomes. The second one, again, there's a big word, dios in deontological means duty. This is about principles, rules, duties that we have. Now, this is very different to the previous one, because here it's not about outcomes, it's about principles. Okay? What's right and what's wrong on principle, irrespective of the outcome. So if I use this mode of ethical decision making, I say, well, what are the rules? What are the principles that are guiding me here? And I'm going to decide on principle, irrespective of the outcome. Do you see the difference of that? Now, in terms of principles, rules, duty, one day when I was driving to JBC and stuck in this traffic, I saw this sign: stealing power is a crime. Now, can you see that's a principles-based argument? It's a crime, full stop. Okay, irrespective of outcome, it's wrong. End of story. Can you see how this is an argument from principles or from rules? Again, to try and bring that back to our bribe example, if I'm faced with that situation of do I pay a bribe or not, I might say, no, by principle, by rule, by law, do not bribe, full stop. Okay, there's that principle of non-bribery, of non-corruption, etc., irrespective of the outcome. Or perhaps I'm sort of struggling to think of a principle that actually would lead a person to go with a bribery. Perhaps that person would be following the principle of going with the flow, or of choosing your battles, or something like that. So this way of making decisions is about asking what is inherently right or wrong, independent or irrespective of any outcomes. And I think you will be able to see that the Bible has a lot of that, right? It has a lot of laws, commands, principles, rules, guidelines, etc. It can range from very specific rules to general principles. And one of the challenges, I think, is to sort of figure out, at what sort of level do I do this? So, for example, if the Bible tells us if someone asks you to go 1 mile with them, then go and carry that load for the 2nd mile as well. Now, you could go to that and say, okay, but it's got to have to do with walking. It's got to be 1 mile, exactly 1 mile, and not kilometer. And only then will this principle or this rule apply. And you can see what I'm now doing is I'm almost like making it too narrow and making it too specific. But then I can almost like err on the other side, and I can roll that up all the way to, I don't know, love people. And just sort of roll it all up just to the love principle. But now I've made it almost like too big, too general to guide me with regard to specific issues. So one of the challenges then is, at what sort of level am I operating with regard to that? We need to be careful that we don't take some of what the Bible says too specifically. If your neighbor's ox falls in the pit, okay, but it's got to be the ox and it's got to be a pit, and otherwise it doesn't apply. That would be too specific. But if we roll everything up just to love and justice, well, then we don't have something that actually guides us in specific complex decisions. I suppose I've given a little bit by way of positives and pitfalls already, but try and think of one or two more. I think one of the huge positives of this mode of making decisions ethically is that it recognizes the moral nature of reality and certainly of humanity. Okay, so that it recognizes that perhaps some things are just inherently right or wrong. I think it helps to counter our self-centeredness with a sense of duty. So often, in the heat of the moment, let's be honest, the way we decide is, what's best for me, and not necessarily what's really best. And I think being aware of principles or rules helps us to actually decide well, just to have that sort of almost like that sense of duty beyond ourselves. There are certain things, certain rules we must follow. The pitfalls, one of them, I'm pretty sure you would have seen it, is one needs to be careful that this doesn't become legalism, right? That one is just, totally legalistic about it. Potential pitfall is a lack of grace. Potential pitfall is that I focus so much on the principles that I forget to focus on God. Okay, I focus so much on the rules that God gives that I forget the rule giver. One can also fall into the potential pit of not seeing the intentions behind the rules. So I think it's important just for our discernment, not to just know the rule, but also to know the intention behind the rule. One potential pitfall is that this way of working may underplay wisdom because I'm just blindly following rules rather than actually applying myself to a complex decision. Another potential pitfall is that it can be unrelational, and it can be low on character change, which brings me to the third one, which is virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is about what is virtuous. It's about our character. And what we're looking for in terms of virtue ethics is not just doing good, but also being good. So I think the whole point in virtue ethics, and a point that the other two modes have actually missed, and something that virtue ethics adds to this, is just the realization that what we do flows from who we are. So this ethic looks more on being than on doing, right? It's aware of who we are shapes what we do, and it asks the question and it focuses on, so who are we? So this is about development of character. It's about development of virtues, the inner disposition of the heart. This one will ask, what has captivated our hearts and minds? And this one can see, I think, in a way that the other two, the first two, can't, that there might be, our motive might be important, that we can do the right thing in the wrong way or with the wrong motive. So let me give you an example. Perhaps it's a bit of a silly example. I am driving the speed limit. Okay. What do you think about that? Is that good or bad? Well, on the surface, it looks good, but let's dig underneath the surface and look at my motive. Now, my motive might be, well, there's a police car driving behind me and I don't want to get a ticket, therefore I drive speed limit. Okay, in which case it's just, I suppose, expedient. It's what's good for me. I'm doing that essentially for selfish reasons. I could be driving the speed limit because I am taking someone to the airport. They have a plane to catch and they're in a hurry, and I deliberately want to irritate them because I don't like them, and so therefore I'm driving the speed limit. Now, in that case, almost like my motivation would be a negative motivation. Or maybe I'm driving the speed limit because I've got an old car and it just won't go any faster, even if I tried. In which case, driving the speed limit wouldn't actually have a moral dimension to it. It would be an amoral thing. There's no moral, no ethical dimension to it. It's just the limitations of my car. So can you see, on the surface it looks the same, but underneath the surface I might have very different motivations. I'm trying to sort of, again, bring that back to our bribery example that I've been using, perhaps in this case, I might decide incorruptibility is a virtue. Okay, integrity is a virtue, and my integrity does not permit me to pay that bribe. I'm struggling to find a way of taking, with virtue ethics, getting to a point where I'm actually going to pay that bribe. And perhaps that's also why virtue ethics is a helpful addition to the other two. One of the things, if you look at your notes, I forget who made that quote, but at crucial moments of choice, most of the business of choosing is already over. I think that's key. Think back to our scenario, right? So that scenario where you're hiding the one guy and the next person comes with a gun. There's almost like in the heat of that moment, how you're going to decide is going to be determined by almost like by who you are and by all the little decisions you've made so far in your life. Because in that situation, you're not going to have the luxury of telling the guy with the gun, okay, hang on, let me just think this through. Okay, outcomes-based ethics, principle-based ethics. Okay, you won't have that luxury. So in the end, you're just going to essentially just, in some ways, play out the person that you have become to date. And so it is important for us to become people of good virtue, of good character. So one day when I was driving to JBC and I was stuck in this traffic, I didn't actually see a sign that I think worked along the virtue ethic road. So a question to you would be, what would you put on that sign from a virtue ethic argument point of view? So if virtue ethics is about asking, what would a good person do, then perhaps your sign might say something like, I don't know, good people pay their electricity or something like that, right? So just any answer that connects us to character, to virtue, to who we are would be a correct answer in this particular example. Think again through some positives and some pitfalls on this. The positives might certainly include that I think that it recognizes being and becoming, that it recognizes the importance of character formation in a way that the other two modes of ethical decision making haven't quite. Okay, it recognizes the role of intentions and dispositions and motives, and that's important. It recognizes, I think, the role of community, because we're asking, okay, so who is a good person? We are listening to those who are virtuous. Okay, so we are picking someone who is of good standing in the community, and we're listening to what they're saying. Potential pitfalls, I think, again, on its own, if virtue ethic is the only way we seek to make decisions, then we need to be careful that we don't downplay the importance of doing. Because remember, both being and doing are both important. We also, I think, need to be careful that we don't underestimate the reality of the sinful nature. So virtue ethics, to some extent, assumes that, if we just keep working hard at it, is that we will become really good people who will just almost like automatically express in difficult situations what is good and what is noble. And I think if we are aware of our sinfulness, I think we need to also acknowledge that that's not always going to happen. Okay, even for those of us who are mature, even for those of us who are following Jesus closely, there's still that sin effect that we mustn't underestimate. I think the other potential pitfall of this is that I don't think virtue ethics on its own helps us with the complexity of some decisions. Okay, so it's difficult to apply to some of the more complex public decisions that we have. So think of some of the medical ethics stuff or the beginning and end of life issues. Okay, there are complex issues there, And the question, what would a virtuous person do, is actually not going to fully help us unpack that complexity. Here's another way of, I suppose, summarizing that, which is, think of a tree. I know I've used the tree metaphor before, but in a little way, outcomes is about the fruit of the tree. Okay, so what type of fruit do we want to see from our decisions? And then the principles is a little bit more of the roots. Okay, so what sort of principles, rules, laws, guidelines are we rooted in? And then the virtue ethics, the character ethics, is a little bit about what type of a tree do I or you or we want to be. And so I found this metaphor helpful just to remember the three. Okay, so root and fruit and the type of tree that we are. Okay, so what principles are we rooted in? What outcomes are we seeking? What tree is it? And I think what I'm hoping is also obvious from this is that there is value in all three of these, and all three of these are best used together. And I think so we obviously need to be aware of the pitfalls of each, but the reason we've spent such a long time on this is that all three of these are valuable, and they are part of our toolbox for thinking through some of the ethical decisions and ethical nuances of life. And so I'm hoping that this is going to be a helpful toolbox for you. Again, just to make the link to the Bible, in case you're wondering, where in all the world am I going, and is this in the Bible at all? Think through this a little bit. What are some biblical examples of each of those three? Let me let's start with the easy one, which is the one in the middle on this slide, which is the deontological ethics. In other words, the principles or law or rules-based way of making decisions. So what do you see in the Bible by way of that? Now, your answers may be different, or you may have other answers, but certainly everything around the law, everything around the Ten Commandments, I mean, there you have rules, principles, whatever word you want to use, commandments. So that certainly fits in that category. Do unto others as you would have them do to you. That would be a principle. It's just an example. You have other examples. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's a principle, etc., etc. There's much more. Now, what about the teleological, the outcomes-based ethics? Do we find anything along those lines in the Bible? Again, some possible answers. Think of the Beatitudes. Blessed are these people because of that outcome, usually. There are specific examples. One of the ones I love to use is when Jeremiah speaks to the people in exile in Babylon, and he says, seek the good of the city, because if it prospers, you prosper. So in some ways, that's an outcomes-based thing. Okay, so seek the good of the city, even if you don't like these guys, because it's also best for you. It's a good outcome. And I think all, in Old Testament and New, the seeking of the shalom, of the right order of things, of the flourishing of human beings and human community, that's a seeking of good outcomes. Quite a few proverbs are around outcomes. If you read through some of them, you'll see what I mean. And I think most so that statements in the Bible. Okay, so do this so that, and whatever the outcome is. There's an outcome after the so that, usually, not always, but certainly there's a lot of an outcomes focused in the Bible also. And then lastly, virtue or character ethics, give that a go. And as always, pause the video if you need. Amongst other things, you could have answered the fruit of the Spirit, all right? So those are virtues, those are character-based things, those are things of not only what we do, but also of who we are. And then think of some of the what I've called the put on, put off lists in Paul's letters, where he says put on this but put off that, or clothe yourself with this and take off that. Or sometimes he says, follow the way of the Spirit rather than the way of the flesh. There's different ways that he makes those lists, but there's always like the good side and the bad side. Those are often, if you read them, they're actually often about relational virtues. Okay, so put on is about what is relationally positive, and put off is about all the stuff that damages and diminishes and corrupts relationship. Have a look at those lists. Okay, so to me, there's certainly also a virtue element in those. Now, to firm that up, just an exercise or two, I've made a table in which we have the three modes of decision making and a for and against option. And I've given you two examples in your notes. The first one was around, you can choose other examples. I just thought some that are really, that are possibly controversial and possibly quite emotive, things that we can get quite upset or excited about. I'm deliberately trying to choose examples like that. So if you were to try this one, there has been a debate, and there will continue to be a debate around whether prostitution should be legalized in our country. Now, there are various arguments for and against, but let's just try and structure our thinking around this. And let's try and fill each cell in that table. So let's start top left. Can you think of an outcomes-based argument for legalizing prostitution? Okay, so somebody who would be for the legalization of prostitution, how would they argue their case from an outcomes point of view? Again, give yourself a moment. Here's my possible answer, is that there's such a lot of exploitation of those who are in this industry of the sex worker, and the whole reason for wanting to legalize prostitution is that they say that now the sex worker is protected. They cannot be exploited and abused the way that they currently are. So let's legalize prostitution because it gives the outcome of being better for the sex worker. Now, also still on outcomes-based argumentation, how would you argue against the legalization of prostitution from an outcomes point of view? And perhaps there you might say something like this, that legalizing prostitution hasn't really had good results elsewhere. You would point to other countries in which it has been legalized, and where the desired outcomes of the proponents just haven't been realized. It doesn't work. It doesn't do anything better, is an argument you may use. Now, can you see what I'm sort of doing here? I'm not expecting you for this exercise to agree or disagree. Okay? I'm just asking you to analyze what is happening in terms of some of the discussions, some of the debates that we're having. My hope in an exercise like this is that it gives us a deeper understanding of an issue, because it'll allow us to look at angles that perhaps we haven't seen before. Also, that perhaps it helps us understand the opposing point of view better, and helps us see what's happening in those debates and in those disagreements. But I digress. Let's move on in the table. We are now on the cell that looks at principles and for legalizing prostitution. So can you think of an argument for legalizing prostitution that is based on principles or rules? Here's my attempt. So people who would be for it would say, yes, but it's about the rights of the sex worker, right? And human rights is a principle, or perhaps also the principle of, yeah, but everybody should be allowed to choose their profession. Again, I'm not asking you to agree with this. I'm just asking you to see that it's that kind of an argument, right? It's a principles-based argument. And then the opposite of that, a principles-based argument against legalizing prostitution. Perhaps something like saying, well, it turns out that most sex workers have not freely, voluntarily chosen their profession. Okay? You'll find very few people in this industry who actually like being in it. They feel trapped in it. They feel abused in it. Okay, they feel having been conned into it and not being able to get out. So, by way of principle, we should be against legalizing prostitution because, it's just an abusive environment. You could also just say, look, adultery is wrong, full stop. There's my principle. There's my law. And that would be an argument based on principle or on rules. Okay, and then let's do the last row. So we're on virtue or character ethics. Can you think of a virtue or character argument for prostitution? Or rather for legalizing it. That's what we're doing. Perhaps you might say, do we want to be a prescriptive society? So remember, in virtue ethics, we are asking what type of a people, what type of a society do we want to be? And somebody for the legalization might say, well, we want to be the type of society in which there is freedom, and even freedom to make those choices, and even freedom to make choices that we may not personally agree with. Okay, we need to preserve our freedom. Whereas somebody against legalization of prostitution might say, well, do we want to be an immoral society? What does prostitution do for the sexual morality of our society? Surely we don't want to be an immoral society, so we shouldn't allow this. Okay? So again, can you see, you can actually have arguments this way or that way in each of those categories, in each of those modes of decision making. And again, just to reiterate, what I'm hoping is that if one were to work through a table like this, that it actually gives us a fuller picture, that perhaps it allows me to see more than I've been able to see before. It's a tool to help me think through this thing a little bit deeper. And then another one I gave you, I'm not going to go through this one. You can do this one on your own, but just another, I think, very emotive and very important issue in our country is think of land expropriation without compensation, and then try and fill in the table yourself on each of these. Press pause, do it. Don't do it later. Rather do it now. Okay, as I said, I'm not going to try give you answers on that one, but you're welcome to engage me on that at any stage. Taking it a level deeper, what shapes and influences and informs these three modes? So I've given you these three modes, but here's the issue, right? That in itself, those three modes aren't enough yet in terms of us really, really coming to grips with ethics, because here's the problem. So yes, outcomes are important, but what or whose outcomes do we want? Yes, principles are important, but what or whose principles are we going with? Okay, who decides what the principles are? It's the says who problem. And then also similar with virtue, what ideas of virtue or whose idea of virtue do we uphold? Who gets to make those decisions? Okay? Who makes the rules? Who decides what a good person is? Who decides what type of outcomes to look at? So can you see, we actually need to dig a level deeper to work our way through that. And perhaps another way to illustrate that is, let me give you this as a brief exercise. What, in your opinion, are the 5 top moral issues in South Africa today? So the main moral issues we're facing in our country, what are they? Make a quick list. Again, I'm not going to give you much time So pause if necessary. Right, the question is, it's just an experiment. Let's see how it worked. Was your list a little bit more like this? Or was your list a little bit more like that? Okay, now, I think I certainly know people whose list would look like the one on the left. I know other people whose list would look like the one on the right. Can you see there are two quite different come-froms? I know I'm simplifying slightly, but I think sort of the list on the left is what a person of privilege would be likely to come up with. And the list on the right is more a likely list for someone who has not been in privilege, or certainly historically not been in a position of privilege. I'm hoping I'm making sense. So what I'm trying to illustrate with this is that we can have very, very different come-froms, even in deciding what we think the top moral or ethical issues are. So all this by way of pointing to there's something underneath the surface that is happening, and we need to be aware of that we are complex and deep beings. One way to illustrate that, I've got this idea from a guy called Charles Kummer. He talks about the moral scape. Okay, so almost like the landscape in which we do our morals or our ethics. And he points to the fact that there are various different levels in that. And almost like at the surface level are the modes of decision making. Those are the three modes that we've been talking about so long. And they are important, and they are certainly helpful. But it's just the tip of the iceberg in some ways. And underneath the surface, we have, various norms and values that we have as individuals, as communities, as societies. And we have, the whole worldview level, the belief system, what it is that we believe about reality and about what's good and what's bad and what the problem is and what the solution is. And then even deeper, some of our loyalties, okay, some of, we have particular loyalties to particular people or groups or perhaps even parties. And those are strong, strong, strong forces, okay, that are certainly going to influence the way we make ethical decisions. And even just our very experience of reality. And because in a country like ours, different people have such different experiences, we also end up with different, with the rest of the different, okay, we end up with different loyalties, different ways of believing, etc., etc. So this slide, just to help us be aware of everything that's swirling around inside of your heart and mine, inside of your mind and mine. Okay, we are complex beings, and we need to almost like be aware of that, and almost like catch ourselves in terms of, okay, what am I actually believing here? What are my loyalties here? What assumptions am I making? What assumptions am I not seeing, etc., etc.? How does my experience so far shape who I am now, and how I am deciding on this particular issue? It's important that we're aware of that. So, moving on to this idea of, okay, we've been talking about ethics in general, and we've been linking it to the Bible very much. But let's ask the question about Christian ethics and what a Christian ethic might look like. Your heading in your handout is slightly different, if I remember. Now, here's an attempt at answering that. Surely, as Christians, we would say, certainly to our non-Christian friend, that yes, but what we're trying to do with our ethics is we're trying to ground it in ultimate reality. We were trying to be consistent with and connect with in the best possible way to that which is ultimate real. And, as Christians, we certainly believe that God is ultimate reality. So God is the ground of our ethics. Thus, God's goodness is the ground of all our human goodness, all right? Us made in the image of God. It guides what goodness is for us as human beings. Goodness is defined and shaped by the ultimate source of goodness being God. And Jesus, of course, offers the fullest human expression of what it means to be good, because Jesus, being fully God, fully man, also shows us, again, in terms of just, he's our role model, right? In terms of what it means to be good and do good. And a Christian ethic or a biblical ethic would also have something to do with not just ultimate reality, but also how we are connected with that ultimate reality. So here we're talking about things like our biblical worldview, our very identity, I think, as well. So we are moral beings in a moral universe made in the image of a moral God. And Christian or biblical ethics is ethics with a particular basis and purpose, because God is the beginning and end of Christian ethics, so to speak. God is the alpha and the omega of our ethics. In terms of alpha, in terms of beginning, an ethic rooted in him, informed by him, shaped by him, empowered by him. And in terms of the omega, in terms of where the ethic is going, it seeks to serve and reflect and glorify him. So to be good or ethical is to, in some ways, to go with the grain of ultimate reality. It's to express our image of Godness. It's to express our Christ-likeness. So that to me would be, where we would start to go when we would talk about a Christian ethic. To unpack that in slightly more detail, just a framework, an attempt at a framework for Christian or biblical ethics. 3 points in your notes. The first one, God himself, of course, is the triune God himself is the why of our ethics, the what of our ethics, and the how of our ethics. The why of our ethics, so he is the grounding, the motivation. Okay? His nature, his character, his actions, his purposes form the foundation of how we understand goodness. Also the what of ethics, so he is the norm, the content, right? Because of who he is and what he does, he shows us what goodness is. I've given you some examples in your notes. So he shows us justice, and that leads to our concern for justice. His covenant faithfulness is a model for us and a guide for us for our own faithfulness, whether it's in contracts or in marriage, etc. His truthfulness guides our integrity in relationships and responsibilities. His holiness guides our purity of heart and mind and behavior. And his grace, again, helps us and, shows us how we can operate with grace and with mercy towards others. And then, of course, God himself is also the how of our ethics, the power, the means. So he doesn't just show us what and why, but he also, I think, empowers the how by his Spirit. So his grace, salvation, sanctification, common grace powers that. His presence by his Spirit helps us to be and to do more and more the type of people that we should be. Then, secondly, not only God himself, but also God's story. You've seen this before. Please say you've seen this before. But the Bible's big storyline certainly gives us an identity and a worldview to guide us in ethical matters also. Creation, fall, redemption, eternity, all four of those can guide us in our ethics. I'm giving you some examples of each. Again, this is not a complete list, but out of the creation part of the story, just the fact that all human beings are made in God's image, and as a result of that, have worth, have value. That is so important in terms of our ethics, in terms of how we treat each other. I'm sure you can see that. Creation part of the story tells us how God is giving us dominion, meaning to take care of on God's behalf, to steward things well, to take care of well. And so there again, you can see the ethical dimension. And then in creation, of course, we learn that the relational God makes us in his image as relational beings, and so much of ethics is about relationship, right? I think that should be obvious. I mean, the how I treat a stone or a stick isn't particularly an ethical issue, but how I treat another human being is an ethical issue. Ethics is all about relationships. And so, as the Bible tells a relational story and is all about relationships, it really should be able to guide us and help us with regard to our ethics. Moving on to the fall, right? I think some of the things that we learn as a result of the entry of sin into the world and the damage that the sin does is that, in terms of our ethics, one of the things we would try to do is we would try to restrain sin in self and obviously also in the community, in a society, wherever we can. That is a good ethic, right? To limit the power of evil and to seek justice. And the fall helps us understand the need for that and why it's important to do that. Redemption, probably lots more to say that I'm saying, but this idea of loving God and loving neighbor. So love as almost like the ultimate ethic. The whole dimensions of forgiveness, perhaps restitution, renewal, certainly. So can you again see just how I'm bringing a relational focus? No, not I, how God is bringing a relational focus to the ethic. And grace, okay, just something that is so central in the biblical storyline. And so whenever we're thinking ethics, let's also think grace. How do I approach the situation with grace? And the people caught up in the situation with grace. And then lastly, eternity, the future, okay? So I think the hope of heaven does inform our ethics now. It also gives us a meaning. It also, I think, very, very importantly, and we've been through this before, right, helps us understand that there's a now and not yet component to present reality. Okay, so the eternity part of the story, or the renewal part, or the renewed creation part, however you want to call it, that's the not yet. Okay, so some things are partially now, but not fully yet now. Some things are only in the future. And that, I think, also informs our ethics, okay, that we don't try and do too much, try and do too little. Okay, that we apply ourselves to pursue goodness and bring it about wherever we can, but that we're not naive about, being able to create heaven on earth. And so just to remain realistic, to understand what it looks like to live in the real world in the now and not yet. Okay, so God's story, I think, very much helps us with that. If you wanted to do an exercise and take an ethical issue, perhaps take one of those 5 issues that you identified earlier when I asked you what are the 5 top moral issues in our country today. Take one of those and now think through each of the chapters in the storyline, creation, fall, redemption, eternity, and see if you can't shed some light on this issue that you've chosen from God's storyline. Okay? Remember, this issue that you've chosen happens inside the story, so you should be able to almost like connect it within the story and understand the issue better through illuminating it by the story. So again, press pause, try that now, don't try that later. I'm not going to give you an answer. I don't know what your issue is that you've chosen, but just work through that. And then thirdly, perhaps one can also add a few focal points. So within the story, there are some particular focal points that can perhaps help us with our biblical ethics. I'm suggesting some. Again, I'm not claiming that this is a complete list, but certainly, we have in the Old Testament, there's a lot about the nation state of Israel and what's happening there. And what I think we need to be careful of with that is that we don't get bogged down into particulars of particular rules and commands, and we're able to also just take a step back and see the intent behind the rules and the commands. And what we will find is that what's happening there is that God is basically setting up a nation for goodness, okay, for human flourishing, for shalom, for the flourishing of human beings and relationship, for the right ordering of things. And so in some ways then what we have in the nation of Israel in the Old Testament writings is a paradigm for what goodness might look like, what ethics might look like. But again, I just want to warn, don't get stuck into too many of the details and don't try and transport the exact specifics of a different time and a different place into 21st century South Africa. And I think you will have learned some of that in HGW, or will learn it in HGW Old Testament as well. Then, of course, New Testament, the life and the teaching of Jesus. Okay, a lot of his life is a role model for goodness. A lot of his teaching is teaching about what's good and what's not good. A lot of his teaching is about how to be and do good. And then, of course, the work of Jesus, what I mean with that is his death and his resurrection, okay, which is where I think, again, there's something very, very profound that we can see about goodness. And I'll get to a little bit more of that in a moment. And then, of course, I've said it before, relationship as a key theme that goes through the whole Bible. Love God, love neighbor is not just something that Jesus says, okay? It's also something that Jesus actually quotes from the Old Testament. So this is throughout. Relationship has got to inform our ethics as Christians, as those who seek to follow Jesus. And so the intent of these focal points is hopefully they can offer some additional insights or some additional details or nuances within the overall framework of God's story in terms of helping us think through our ethics. Gospel-shaped ethics. So this is about the very core, the very hinge point of God's big story, which is the cross and the empty tomb, Jesus' death and resurrection. And whenever we think of, what should our ethics look like as Christians, surely we need to somehow find our way to the cross and the empty tomb. And we should ask, what would a gospel-shaped ethic look like? Now, this is actually not such an easy thing to explore, right? How would you answer, what does a gospel-shaped ethic look like? And so the table I'm giving you here is, again, not a complete thing. It's just some thoughts, but there is very probably a lot more than this. But here are some of my thoughts. So a cross-shaped ethic means that we certainly focus on questions of both justice and mercy and the combination of those two, because those two come together at the cross. It means that our ethics will also be relationally forgiveness-focused. And the empty tomb will probably take our ethic in the direction of seeking renewal and growth and healing and being hopeful. So whenever we're thinking of ethics and of goodness, those are some of the things that would be going around in our hearts and minds. The cross, perhaps that is focusing more on what we are saved from, okay, sin, the consequences of sin. And the empty tomb, perhaps that leads us or encourages us to focus more on what we are saved for. Okay, there's a renewal, there's a new life, there's a new beginning. There is much of goodness to pursue and to enjoy and to seek to bring about. The cross, sometimes, there is a lot of negative things. There's a lot of bad things that we need to overcome, need to remove, need to change. But I sometimes think as Christians what we need to watch out for is that we don't only just know what we are against, Okay, so sometimes we, it's easier to know what we are against. Don't do this. I don't like that. That's ungodly, etc. That is half of the total story. The other half is also then sort of figuring out what is the positive alternative. Okay, so how do we not only have the absence of the negative, but also the presence of the positive? How can we bring that about? How can we add that in? How can we restore that? How can we be that? So again, just some initial thoughts, that's all this is, on what a gospel-shaped ethic might look like. Right, we're almost at the end, so stay with me. Characteristics of Christian or biblical ethics. Just a few thoughts on what Christian ethics might look like in terms of, I think, both the means and the ends. A few characteristics. One is holiness. Right? So God is holy in his very nature, in his actions. God is holy in his original and final design and intent for us. And again, that informs and shapes our ethic. Our ethic should be Christ-centered. It should be shaped by and through and in Christ. I've said this one a few times. Our ethic is a relational ethic. A relationship as eternally existent within the Trinity and reflected in our creation in his image as relational beings. So what we are looking for when we are seeking goodness as Christians is we are asking what are meaningful and healthy relationships, whether it's with self, with others, with God, with creation. Our ethic as Christians would be grace-filled. Grace, so much central to who God is and his storyline, and very much evidenced by Jesus' sacrificial giving of himself as the only way to be restored to holiness and relationship with God. Our ethic would also be very comprehensive. In other words, it's not just narrow and it's not just focused on do and don't lists for the individual. It involves all of life and reality. It involves our entire being. It involves our total lives, individually, corporately. It involves our head and heart and hands. It involves our being and doing and relating. It's about all of that. And I think one of the things, hopefully, that would have come out over and over out of this session is that ethics is really a comprehensive all-of-life thing. Restorative, okay? The ability to envision the good. Sometimes, I just want to acknowledge that's sometimes very difficult. Okay? Sometimes we're in so much pain that we struggle to find a vision for the good other than, I want the pain to go away. And I want to acknowledge that. But so it's almost like we need to work harder at being able to envisage the good again. What does goodness look like? And allowing the Bible to help us envision that. What does shalom look like? What does it mean to express my hope of heaven now? Okay, what does growth and healing and transformation look like? So again, just some pointers as to, you can see it's not just about technique. It's also just about orientation of heart and mind. It's about who we are. It's about our identity. If you wanted to add another characteristic, please do. I think the exercise I'm giving you there at the end is, what else would you add to this list? And then lastly also, I gave you an exercise of, pick one of the issues. Again, maybe pick the one you picked previously, one of those top 5 that you identified, and just put that next to that list of characteristics on the slide, and see how those characteristics might speak into your approach on the issue. How does it help you almost like think differently, feel differently, perhaps act differently with regard to this particular issue? Don't think about that later. Do that exercise now. I just want to acknowledge source as well and give this as further reading. I'm not sure whether or not this is in the JBC library. It's certainly a book that I found helpful in that some of the ideas out of this session have come from. So this is, I suppose, my source acknowledgement. Let me close in a word of prayer. Lord, this ethics thing is difficult. Sometimes it's easy to figure out what's right and wrong. Sometimes it's not. We face some very complicated issues in our world. There are no easy answers sometimes. Sometimes things look like they are not black and white, but shades of grey. Sometimes we feel like we have to choose between the lesser of two evils. So, Lord, for all those situations, and for the obvious ones also, we pray that you would help us to see goodness better, to make better decisions that are more reflective of who you are and what you are doing and who we are meant to be in the image of you. Lord, help us grow in our Christ-likeness. Help us to be good and to do good. Help us to think good, feel good, act good. And so, Lord, all this is in your hands. Thank you that ultimate reality is you and that you are good. Thank you that the person who runs the universe, who created everything, is the person who is good. So that when we seek to be good, we are not going against the flow of reality, but that we're actually going with your character, your purposes. And Lord, we are aware that of the sin within us that works against that. We are aware of so much sin and pain in the world. And we do pray that you would help us overcome, partially now and fully one day, we pray. Amen.